The cold came first before thought. It seeped into the thin jacket he wore, through the ragged cuffs of his gloves, into the tips of his toes pressed against boots that had long lost their grip on warmth. The snow underfoot was crusted and silent, each step releasing a brittle crunch that echoed against the bare trunks of the forest trees. A pale dawn leaned over the horizon, smearing the sky with washed-out gray and faint strokes of gold that barely touched the world below. He drew his jacket tighter around his shoulders and exhaled. The mist from his breath hung in the air like a faint promise that something was still alive. He had been walking for an hour, though the time didn't matter. The road through the forest was hardly a road at all, more a path beaten into the snow by the few who had passed before him, and now by him, alone. The boy, no more than 16, though the forest and winter made him seem smaller, kept his eyes fixed on the path ahead. His boots were cracked at the heels, and the thin laces that tied them were knotted unevenly, evidence of both care and necessity. Every so often, he kicked at a frozen clump of snow, scattering it, a small, unconscious attempt to mark the monotony of the morning. Home was quiet, too quiet, sometimes, and not the kind of quiet that promised rest, but the kind that pressed against the ribs with absence. His father had not been around for years, and his mother worked long hours at the diner on the outskirts of town. He was left to navigate this small, frayed existence alone, a life measured in chores, quiet errands, and the occasional rush of urgent solitude. The forest offered a temporary refuge, a place where he could move without oversight and yet remain unseen. Here, in the brittle air and the skeletal shadow of trees, he felt the faint stirrings of something beyond survival. A curiosity, a faint pulse of purpose he did not yet recognize. As he walked, the rhythm of his boots against the frozen earth and the faint whistle of the wind became a background to a question he didn't speak. What waits to be found in the spaces people leave behind? The forest had a way of hiding things. Sometimes it hid animals abandoned, lost, or left because they were no longer wanted. Sometimes it hid people, though the boy had never thought to find one. And sometimes it hid truths the world refused to acknowledge, truths only discovered by those unwilling to turn away. The sound came then, faint and hesitant, like a whisper that had been muffled under layers of snow and cold. At first, he thought it was wind playing through the branches, but the rhythm was too deliberate, too patterned to be random. He stopped walking. His boots crunched against the ice, then held still, and the forest seemed to pause with him. He tilted his head, listening, feeling the air, the weight of the early light, the chill threading through his fingers. The sound came again, low, strained, almost a sigh. He stepped off the path, careful to avoid breaking the crusted snow beneath the sparse branches. His breath came in shallow bursts, small clouds against the gray morning. Every detail became immediate. The smell of wet bark, the subtle shift in snow texture where something had moved, the faintest creak of metal in the distance. His stomach tightened. The forest could be empty for miles, yet here, something persisted, struggling against invisibility. Curiosity pressed against his chest, mingled with a hesitant fear he could not name. He was not brave in the way heroes of stories were. He was ordinary, fragile, and tethered to the small routines of survival. Yet he moved forward, guided by the sound and an instinct older than reason, older than his quiet life of chores and homework and hushed evenings at home. Through the trees, shapes began to form. The snow clung to dark, rough silhouettes, and when he stepped closer, the source of the noise revealed itself. 3 donkeys, chained individually to the trunks of sapling trees, barely able to shift, their breath forming pale clouds that rose and disappeared into the morning light. One of them shivered violently, pressing a hoof against the frozen earth in an effort to keep warm. Another had lowered itself into the snow, not sleeping, not resting, but surviving in the only way it knew how. The third tugged at a chain, which scraped against the bark and ground in a faint, grating rhythm. The boy froze, the ache of recognition catching in his chest. These were animals used to labor, kept for work until they were no longer convenient. Their eyes, wide and wary, reflected the faint light with a softness that belonged to creatures who had known kindness in fleeting moments, perhaps, but now were alone, waiting. The wind tugged at their coarse hair, and each shiver seemed to echo his own sense of helplessness. He had never seen suffering like this, not in the pages of books, not in his small life. And yet, there was tangible, immediate, asking for a choice he had not yet known he could make. He reached out a gloved hand, hesitant, and the closest donkey flinched, nostrils flaring, ears twitching. The chain rattled faintly as it shifted, but the contact of human warmth, tentative as it was, seemed to settle a fraction of the trembling that ran through its body. The boy did not speak. Words were unnecessary here. His own pulse raced in rhythm with the shallow, labored breaths of the animals. The forest seemed to hold its breath with him, waiting to see what would happen next. He tore a glance at the path behind him, at the way the snow would swallow his footprints as quickly as they were made. He could leave. He could walk away, as everyone else might. But the air, sharp and clean, carried a simple truth he could not ignore. Walking away would be an answer to nothing. Something inside him shifted, almost imperceptibly, but irrevocably. He knelt in the snow, careful not to startle, not to break the fragile thread of trust that hovered between him and the creatures who had no choice but to wait. And in that moment, he made a silent promise, one without flourish or ceremony. He would not leave them here. He did not yet know how, and he did not yet know what it would cost. But he had seen them, and that was enough to change the course of a morning, a life, a world that seemed otherwise unyielding. The wind gusted through the trees, shaking loose a scattering of frost that tumbled onto the snow like cold rain. The boy rose slowly, boots crunching against the frozen ground, and looked once more at the donkeys, chained and shivering, waiting, not for him, but for something that felt like hope. He squared his shoulders against the wind and began walking back toward the road, toward the town, toward the world he knew he could not yet save. Every step left a mark in the snow, small and fragile, but real. And in the silence of the forest, he felt the weight of a question that would not let him go. Would kindness be enough? The town was quiet when he arrived, the kind of quiet that pressed against the ears with the weight of waiting. The sun had climbed slightly higher, but its light felt weak against the gray of winter clouds, and the wind that had whispered through the forest now rattled loose signs and made the street shiver. He paused at the edge of the first intersection, boots sinking slightly into patches of icy slush. His scarf, still damp with frost from the donkey's breath, hung heavy around his neck. Every sound he carried with him, the crunch of snow, the clink of his backpack, the shallow rhythm of his own pulse, seemed too loud in the hushed streets. He had a plan, though it was fragile, the kind that could shatter with a single dismissal. He would find someone who could help, someone who could do more than he could with the fragile strength of a boy and the urgency of animals slowly succumbing to cold. His legs carried him toward the outskirts of town, past shuttered storefronts and windows glazed with frost, past the diner where the smell of old coffee and fried eggs clung to the air. There, at the edge of a narrow alley, he found the first person who might listen, a man in a worn coat, tending the few stray cats that prowled the winter alleys. The man looked up at him, face lined with years of routine and hard weather, eyes a faint, cautious green. The boy opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated, swallowing against the lump forming there. He had rehearsed nothing. The words would have to be simple, sharp, enough to convey what he had seen without sounding like a tale of fantasy. "There are 3 donkeys," he said finally, voice low, careful. "Chained in the forest, they're freezing. They can't move." The man's hands paused in midair, stirring a small pile of cat food. His lips pressed together, then parted with the faintest exhale, a sound somewhere between disbelief and irritation. "Donkeys," he said. "This time of year? That far up the road? Are you sure?" "Yes," the boy said, more firmly this time, because hesitation now felt like betrayal. "I saw them." There, he stopped, struggling for words that were neither exaggeration nor plea. "They're in trouble. They won't survive the night like this. The older man's eyes flicked to the distant tree line, where the forest swallowed the horizon in gray shadows. For a moment, he looked as though he might dismiss the claim entirely. The boy held his gaze, unwavering. There was no fear in the animals yet, only exhaustion and the need for someone who would stay. He felt, somewhere deep in his chest, a quiet, stubborn insistence. If you leave now, you leave them to nothing. Finally, the man nodded slowly, as though conceding not to the boy but to the weight of truth. "All right," he said, voice careful. "Show me." They walked together back toward the forest, boots crunching against icy paths, the boy leading as he had before, scanning each shadow and dipping the snow for the first glimpse of the animals. The man followed, quiet except for the occasional cough, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Each step carried a weight of anticipation and fear. Neither spoke much, because words might fracture the fragile urgency of what they were about to witness. The clearing appeared slowly, shapes forming against the gray light like forgotten statues. And then the donkeys were there, chains still biting into the sapling trees, shivering under the thin cover of frost. The boy's scarf had thawed slightly in his own warmth, and he pulled it tighter around his neck, glancing at the animals with a mixture of sorrow and determination. One donkey lifted its head at their approach, nostrils flaring, ears flicking with cautious attention. The others remained still, only their shallow breathing betraying the strain of cold that pressed into every joint. The older man knelt slowly, hand extended, fingers brushing against the metal chain with careful reverence. "My God," he said softly. The sound carried no accusation, no judgment, only the weight of recognition. He had seen cruelty before, yes, but not this quiet, patient kind. The kind that did not shout, but simply allowed suffering to persist until someone noticed. The boy knelt as well, brushing a hand against the nearest donkey's neck. The warmth was faint, but it was enough to elicit a soft shiver of relief from the animal. Its eyes were wide, reflecting the dim light of morning, liquid with trust and confusion. The boy felt a lump in his throat, the same mixture of sorrow and stubborn hope that had driven him through the forest. These creatures had no voice to plead, no power to demand. He was their advocate, whether he had chosen the role or not. He glanced at the older man, searching for guidance, but found only quiet observation. And perhaps that was all the permission he needed. He began examining the chains, tracing the rusted metal with fingertips stiff from cold. They were thick, almost too thick for one boy to handle alone. He could feel the bite of cold steel through his gloves. He looked to the forest edge, the path leading back to town, imagining the hours it would take to return with proper tools. His chest tightened, not with fear, but with the acute awareness of responsibility. The oldest donkey shifted its weight, pressing against the chain as though testing the possibility of release. The boy whispered to it softly, not expecting a response, but needing the sound of life in the frozen clearing. The older man watched him, expression unreadable, until he finally spoke. "We'll need something strong. Bolt cutters. Something heavy. Can you get them?" "Yes," the boy said, because he had already calculated the journey back to town, the risk, the cold, the minutes that would tick away like the last chance to save someone who could not speak. "I can get them." The decision hung between them, as quiet and fragile as the frost clinging to the donkeys' coats. It was a small choice, yet contained everything: the determination to act, the refusal to walk away, the willingness to face exhaustion and doubt. The boy had discovered something essential. Kindness required courage, but not bravado. It required presence, persistence, and a quiet insistence that one action, however small, mattered more than the possibility of failure. He rose to his feet, boots cracking against the frozen earth, and looked once more at the animals. They watched him with eyes that seemed to understand he was their only chance. A shiver ran down his spine, not from cold this time, but from the weight of responsibility. The older man adjusted his coat, hefted a bag over one shoulder, and nodded. Together, they began the walk back toward the town, toward tools, toward the fragile hope that action could reach the suffering hidden in the quiet of the forest. The snow fell lightly as they went, flakes brushing against hair and coats, each one a reminder that the world was indifferent, and yet, still, small gestures of care could make a difference. Each step forward was a promise, each breath a preparation for the work ahead. The forest, now behind them, seemed both vast and intimate, holding the echo of what awaited their return. The boy glanced back once, just beyond the line of trees, and saw the donkeys still waiting, tethered, shivering alive. And in that glance, he understood. The choice had been made, but the journey was only beginning. The tools were heavy, heavier than he had imagined. Bolt cutters cradled in his hands felt awkward, foreign, and yet, in that weight, there was purpose. The older man had lent them without hesitation, but there had been a quiet glance exchanged, one that said, "We are not equipped for miracles, only effort." The boy nodded, wrapping his frost-stiffened fingers around the cold steel, feeling the vibration of urgency through his palms. The forest, now thick with the deeper gray of approaching afternoon, awaited them, and with it, the small lives that depended entirely on their return. The road back was harsher than the morning. Snow had shifted with wind and footfall, hiding the familiar grooves they had left hours before. Every step was measured, careful because slipping meant delay, and delay meant more suffering. The boy's chest burned with exertion, his breath ragged and pale against the dim light. He kept his eyes forward, but his mind replayed the images of the donkey's eyes, the quiet, wordless pleas, the thin line of frost along their eyelashes, the faint tremble of limbs that should have been free. He wondered, in that moment, if there had been someone responsible for leaving them there, or if it had simply been neglect turned cruel through indifference. When they reached the clearing, the animals had not moved. Their presence was almost spectral against the snow, heads low, bodies trembling, chains glinting faintly in the wan light. The boy knelt beside the nearest one, brushing his gloved hand over the coarse fur, tracing the rope-like bite of the chain that had held it immobile. A shiver ran through its frame at the touch, but it did not flinch away. Some recognition had formed, small and fragile. The older man crouched behind him, scanning the edges of the trees as though expecting someone, anyone, to appear and disrupt the quiet persistence of care. "This isn't random," the man said quietly, voice low enough not to startle the animals. "Someone left them here deliberately." His words carried no accusation toward the boy, but toward the emptiness of the world that allowed suffering to persist without notice. Logging crews sometimes abandon animals. Work slows, they're seen as burdens. People stop caring once something's no longer useful. The boy nodded, though he did not speak. The truth pressed against him like the cold, undeniable and heavy. He had imagined cruelty in the abstract before, in books or stories. But to see in the flesh, to see the weight of someone's decision borne by shivering, tethered creatures, made morality immediate. It was no longer theory. It was snow, steel, and living bodies that might not survive the night. He began examining the chains more closely, hands tracing every groove and rusted link. The cold bit at his fingers, but he barely noticed. He was aware of only one thing. These animals could not wait. The older man knelt beside him, pulling a small notebook from his coat pocket. He jotted something down, measurements, observations, perhaps evidence to be used later. "We'll need proof," he said, not questioning the boy's resolve, but acknowledging that the world rarely recognized effort without documentation. "Someone will want to know whose responsibility this is. Records, names, times, everything matters." The boy absorbed the words, understanding them even as they complicated the immediacy of rescue. He had expected only chains and cold, not the sprawling consequences of ownership, legality, and neglect. Yet he did not hesitate. He understood now that rescue was not simply a physical act. It was also a challenge to the systems that allowed indifference to flourish. He took a deep breath, the icy air filling his lungs, and steadied the bolt cutters in his hands. He lifted the tool against the first chain. The metal resisted, old and rusted, bent with years of strain. With a determined squeeze, the link parted with a sharp, ringing crack that seemed louder than it should in the hush of the forest. The donkey jerked slightly, but did not panic, as if it, too, had learned to measure hope with caution. The boy exhaled, a small release, and moved to the next. Each cut carried a weight, not just the physical strain, but the moral insistence that every action mattered. As the third chain parted, a sudden noise from the trees froze both the boy and the older man. A figure emerged, a man, middle-aged, flannel coat dusted with snow, expression sharp with surprise and irritation. "What do you think you're doing?" he barked, voice carrying the authority of ownership, though the boy could see the hesitation beneath it. "Those animals belong to me." The boy froze, gripping the bolt cutters. The older man stepped forward slightly, notebook in hand, but said nothing. He had learned that silence could weigh heavier than argument. The figure glared at them, then glanced at the freed donkeys, still shivering but no longer tethered. The sight of life pressed against the edge of authority, and for a moment, the man's bravado faltered. "They were left in the snow," the boy said simply. "They couldn't survive like that. You know it." His voice was steady, though his chest pounded. The world seemed to narrow into this moment. Chains, eyes, and cold pressing him forward. "We can help them. You can too if you choose." The man's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he looked away, at the forest floor, at the sky, at the animals who had no choice but to wait. The older man shifted, closing the notebook gently. "Sometimes responsibility isn't about ownership," he said. "It's about seeing what needs to be done." The tension lingered, thin as frost on branches, until the figure finally sighed and dropped his hands. There were no raised voices, no frantic gestures, only the quiet acknowledgement that the world had chosen someone to act where it had not. He turned, wordlessly assisting in guiding the donkeys away from the trees, supporting them as they struggled to stand. The boy stayed close, hands brushing coats, murmuring small assurances that he did not know if the animals could understand, but that they could feel. As they moved back toward the road, the wind carried with it the faintest promise of relief. The boy's scarf, soaked and stiff, brushed against the neck of the smallest donkey, and he felt the creature's slight lean against him, a gesture that was neither speech nor thought, but understanding. In that lean, he recognized the subtle, quiet truth of his choice. To see, to act, to stay was sometimes all that life demanded. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, light had shifted further toward gray. The trees stood like silent witnesses to the slow victory of persistence over neglect. The boy looked back once, noting the faint tracks of hoof and boot intertwined in the snow. Proof of passage, proof of care. He understood that this moment, small and fragile, was a beginning, not a conclusion. The mystery of why the donkeys had been abandoned would unfold later, and with it, challenges that demanded more than courage alone. Yet even in the shadow of uncertainty, he felt a quiet satisfaction. A line of thought settled in his chest. Action mattered, observation mattered, and compassion, measured in deliberate steps rather than grand gestures, could leave marks deeper than the coldest winter or the heaviest chains. He glanced at the older man, and their shared glance contained no words, only the acknowledgement that they had done what many would not, and perhaps, in that simple refusal to leave, they had changed more than one life. And as the road stretched ahead, narrowing into distance and silence, the boy understood the truth that would guide every step forward. Seeing suffering was the first burden, acting upon it the first triumph, and staying with it, through cold, doubt, and indifference, was the quiet courage that endured. The forest had grown still in the late afternoon, the gray sky deepening to the dull blue of approaching evening. The wind had eased, leaving a silence that pressed against the boy's ears, making every step, every breath, feel louder than it should. He led the donkeys along the narrow path, toward the small clearing where the older man had parked the truck. Their coats were stiff with cold, breath shallow but steady, and their eyes, wide, wary, and luminous, tracked his every move. He had come to understand each subtle shiver, each reluctant movement as language. The forest had witnessed cruelty, but now it witnessed determination, measured and unwavering. The older man had returned ahead of them, hands shoved deep into his pockets, posture tense as he scanned the scene for any sign of danger. "They're going to need warmth," he said quietly, not looking at the boy. "Blankets, water, food. You can't save them just with chains cut." The boy nodded, gripping the lead rope of the smallest donkey. Responsibility was no longer abstract. It was flesh and steel and breath and frost. The animals depended on him, and he would not fail. Reaching the clearing, the boy saw the truck waiting. Engine off, a faint plume of smoke rising from the exhaust. The older man opened the back doors, and blankets and buckets had been set inside. The donkeys hesitated at the threshold, muscles stiff, limbs trembling. The boy lowered his voice and began whispering softly to them, words without expectation, just the sound of calm intent. Slowly, cautiously, the animals moved forward, one after another, their hooves crunching in the snow, chains clinking faintly as they trailed behind. Each small step was a triumph, each pause a test of patience. As the last donkey entered the truck, a shadow moved near the treeline. A man emerged, face weathered, coat dusted with snow, hands clenched in muted fury. "You can't do this," he shouted, though the sound had the hollowness of desperation. "They're mine. I own them." His voice cracked, but not with anger alone. It carried the tremor of accountability he had long avoided. The boy stepped forward, heart hammering, hand still on the rope. "They were left to freeze," he said, voice calm, but carrying a weight that the man could not ignore. "You know it. You left them when they needed care. They didn't choose this. You did." The man's eyes flicked to the donkeys, their heads low but not defeated, breathing steady for the first time in days. He swallowed, and for the first time, the boy saw uncertainty etched into the lines of authority. The older man, notebook in hand, stepped beside him. "Neglect isn't ownership," he said. "It's a crime, and the law notices when life is treated as disposable." For a long moment, no one spoke. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the trees, brushing against hair and coats, falling into the soft pile of white beneath their boots. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath. Then the man's shoulders slumped, tension giving way to reluctant acknowledgement. He nodded, quietly, almost imperceptibly, and gestured toward the truck. "Take them," he said, voice low. I'll follow the rules. I'll answer for this." The boy exhaled a long, quiet release, feeling the weight of months, even years, of inertia lift slightly from his chest. He climbed into the truck bed, hands brushing along the donkey's flanks, checking for frostbite, for injuries, for any sign of lingering weakness. The animals leaned slightly against him, as though recognizing a fragile, human shield, and he felt the smallest spark of connection, the sort of understanding that didn't need words. Driving back toward town, the road blurred in the dim light, snow packed against the tires, each mile a testament to persistence and care. The older man sat in the cab, quiet, occasionally glancing at the rearview mirror where the donkeys rested uneasily but alive. "You did good," he said finally, voice carrying the approval of one who understood the weight of responsibility. Most would have walked away. The boy didn't respond immediately. Words felt inadequate, but in the stillness of the moment, he understood that goodness was measured in small, deliberate steps, not in declarations or grand gestures. By the time they reached the sanctuary, the sun had dipped further, casting long shadows across the snow. Volunteers were waiting, ready with warm water, feed, and blankets. The donkeys were guided carefully from the truck, their hooves sinking slightly into the fresh layer of snow in the enclosure. They shook themselves, stamping, breathing heavier now with relief, and the boy knelt, brushing a hand across the flank of the smallest one. It leaned into him with trust that had been earned through quiet persistence, not loud heroics. The older man handed him the notebook, pages filled with careful documentation, measurements, and observations. "This will help them," he said. "They'll be safe now because someone noticed, recorded, acted." The boy traced a finger along the lines, realizing that responsibility extended beyond the moment of rescue. The world might still harbor neglect, indifference, cruelty, but every act of care, however small, cast a line of accountability that could not easily be ignored. Later, standing outside the sanctuary, the boy watched the donkeys settle into their new space, heads dipping to eat, bodies curling against one another for warmth. The wind had softened, the forest receding behind him like a memory he could almost forget. He felt exhaustion deep in his bones, but it was the good kind, the kind that follows effort and moral clarity. He had entered the day unsure if he could make a difference. He left with the quiet knowledge that presence mattered, that insistence mattered, that kindness, sustained and deliberate, could bend the coldest circumstances toward life. The older man clapped him on the shoulder. "Not everyone is willing to see," he said, voice low but steady. "Even fewer are willing to act. You've done more than most." The boy nodded, watching the animals stir in the sanctuary light, shadows soft against the walls, and felt a shift inside himself. Courage was not a shout or a rush. It was the choice to endure, to return, to refuse to abandon. Days later, the authorities followed through. Records confirmed neglect, fines were levied, and regulations were strengthened for animals used in labor. No one celebrated vengeance. No one cheered the humiliation of failure. Instead, the world acknowledged responsibility, slow and deliberate, like sunlight breaking through frost. The boy understood, then, that justice was not always dramatic. It could be quiet, measured, and still carry the weight of moral victory. Returning home that evening, he walked along a path now softened by a thin cover of fresh snow, boots leaving prints that would soon vanish. The forest behind him looked less forbidding now, the shadows less accusing. He thought of the donkeys, warm, fed, alive, and understood that the moment of reckoning had not ended with chains cut. It continued in vigilance, in care, in the quiet choices to notice and act in a world often too indifferent to wait. He paused at the edge of the woods, looking back at the tree line, fading into distance. A small gust of wind stirred the branches, carrying the faintest echo of movement, the soft imprint of life preserved through determination. He felt the lessons settle quietly within him. Some beings survive not because the world is kind, but because one person refuses to walk away. It was a truth simple, unadorned, and heavy with meaning. And as he turned toward home, the boy understood that life could still be hard, circumstances still cruel, but there was a path through it, a path marked by courage, compassion, and refusal to abandon those who cannot speak for themselves. The forest behind him held its silence, but in that silence, he sensed that he had changed something essential, irrevocable. Some acts of care, small though they seem, leave traces far beyond the immediate moment, guiding the lost toward warmth, hope, and safety. He walked on, snow soft under his boots, heart steady, knowing that the world had not been remade, but that within it he had discovered a power both fragile and absolute. The power to act when others would not, and to endure when hope alone seems insufficient.